Caleb, who has no preferred pronouns this time, even though he's had them in the past. So I'm going to use the past ones. Caleb's calling in to ask a question about morality. So, Caleb, you're on with myself and Promise.
All right. Thank you for answering my call. And I was just kind of wondering what your opinion is as an atheist on morality. Like, do you think it's objective, and what decides what morality actually is just my question.
Yeah. So I've got an entire lecture up online called The Superiority of Secular Morality, which I'd recommend to view to go into more detail. But for me, the foundation that I use for morality is the well-being of thinking creatures, which I was using around the same time that Sam Harris's Moral Landscape came out. And so we're kind of on the same page there. And with that foundation is ultimately subjective, just like any foundation. You're basically saying, here's what I want to point to. And then in referencing it, those assessments can be objective, just like ultimately the rules of the game of chess are arbitrary and subjective. We invented chess. Chess wasn't sitting out there. But once you have the rules, you can objectively evaluate positions with respect to goals and objectively identify which moves are better than others. If there are other possible foundations, and there are, Promise was talking to me about somebody who uses consent as their foundation. Tied in closely with consent and well-being is the notion of individual autonomy. They may all tie together. If there's a better foundation that demonstrably improves the world, I'm open to that. And then you might just say, because we are humans with similar problems, similar minds, and similar preferences, that we're going to come up with similar foundations and maybe just label it differently. But the foundation is subjective. The assessments respective to that foundation are non-subjective.
All right. So kind of on that though, do you think it's just based on opinion though too?
It's not. So I wouldn't say it's based merely on opinion. Ultimately, it is based on a preference. But if you decide that the preference is, I want a world that's better for me to live in, and then you start looking around, you can say, okay, well, let's just start with just Matt's well-being as a foundation. Unfortunately, you find out fairly quickly that my well-being alone isn't a good enough foundation, because I share space with other people and my life impacts theirs and their life impacts mine. And so in many cases, doing something in the short term that may inhibit my well-being, but benefit the well-being of many others, will then contribute back to me in this complex web. It's not just the foundation is, what I would say is the foundation is an opinion and subjective, but it's not arbitrary, because it is tied to the fact that we are living creatures and so us and the world are both factors in that. And that part's not arbitrary.
Yeah, so one thing that I still kind of don't really think I get when it comes to this, so I mean, I am a Christian, but why, were the Nazis wrong? And I know, of course, you're going to say yes, right? I mean, of course.
The Nazis were wrong with respect to my moral foundation, and with respect to virtually any moral foundation that addresses a better world.
Okay, so you said,
for clarity, my apologies. I know I paused there. I just want to make sure this is clear. The Nazis may have thought they were working towards a better goal, a better world, but even by their own standard of what leads to a better world, their methods and views were demonstrably contrary to that. They just did not, they were too myopic. Like the people who advocate for stealing or slavery, they don't consider the broader impact on the world and how that will, as I was noting, reflect back on them. That's it. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what was that? So you said, when I first said this, were you saying they're wrong based on your morality?
Yes. And based on their own.
Yeah, I mean, well, to them, they did probably think they were right. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure
They
some of
thought
them
they were
maybe thought it
right.
was
They thought,
wrong.
what I'm saying is, if they thought they were building a better world, they were wrong. They did irreparable damage to the world and to themselves. Well, maybe not irreparable. Everything's going to be reparable in time for the most part, except for all the people who died. That's irreparable.
Yeah, so then if it's just based on your morality, and to your morality it's wrong, then it still is sort of based on just like an opinion. And there's something that we have
I've
kind of
already
like, I
acknowledged
feel
that.
like, what?
I've already acknowledged that. There is no solution to it. What is your solution to this problem that
Right.
you
That's
think you found?
Caleb, that's my question for you is how does Christianity resolve this issue?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that it explains something. I'm not saying just because we have an explanation, it means that something is correct. But we do have this sort of built-in morality that tells us what is right and wrong. And so what I'm saying is that you can clearly see that from a naturalistic view where we just evolved by a natural process, then morality truly is based on opinion, is my point.
My response to that is you're complaining that reality is based on opinion, and then you gave us your opinion. I do not share your opinion that there is a God. I do not share your opinion that the moral claims of the Bible or Christianity are true or objective or holding on us. So what we have is me expressing a foundation of well-being, and you expressing a foundation of God. The difference is you have no way to demonstrate that there is a God or what God thinks about morality or why what God thinks about morality is relevant. You can't do it with the Bible. You can't do it unless God shows up and says, hey, here's my thoughts on morality. I have no way of knowing what God thinks about morality. And even if God showed up and said, here's my thoughts on morality, that wouldn't make them binding or objective. So you still haven't solved the problem. There's not a single problem with subjective morality that is in any way solved by appealing to a God, even if the God's real.
Okay, so I would want to like point out really quick though that when I point this out, I think a common misconception, I'm not trying to change the subject, just kind of something I wanted to clarify. I'm not sure if you know or not. I know you've probably heard this argument before, but the moral argument, and I know there's many of them, does not say that, and like what I'm saying is not that atheists can't be moral, because atheists can be moral like anybody else. That's not the point.
Caleb, why are you bringing up something that's completely irrelevant to this discussion? I neither said nor implied that you think atheists can't be moral. And this is irrelevant. Whether or not atheists can be moral is irrelevant to whether or not your foundation or mine is in any way broken or true. So you've moved on to something completely irrelevant.
I was just bringing it up just to let you know.
Well, instead of bringing it up, why don't we deal with the discussion we're actually having rather than bringing in a big old fucking red herring?
Okay, so what is like the main thing here that, like, what is your question for me? You might have already said it, but
I have a question. I'm just curious. So, Matt has explained his position on morality, which I 100% agree with everything he said so far. But for you, if I were, you make this claim that you're following objective morality. And my problem with that is if I ask you and I ask a bunch of other Christians about some specific things of whether they think they're moral or immoral, you can all use the Bible to make completely different cases. So it's still subjective at that point. You are still also subjectively picking and choosing what you think is, morally objective or not. So how is that not exactly the same, except for skipping over some steps and just relying on this old text instead of observing reality and maybe looking at the standard of well-being?
Before you answer, just
what's the point of the question?
Okay, so first of all, I was interrupting just for clarity. We know that you didn't bring up the Bible, so I didn't want you to think Eve's thing was
yeah, sure. It's only because you said you're a Christian that I brought that up.
But why would you ask, what's the point of the question, instead of just answering it?
because I guess maybe I didn't really hear. Here, let me turn this off speak. There. Like, what exactly was the question again?
Go ahead,
Do
Eve.
you want me to repeat the whole thing? If
Just like the main parts.
So Matt has laid out our position on morality and what parts are subjective and what, foundations we can point to as like an objective standard for something. I'm asking you because you presented this problem of Nazis. So how does Christianity resolve that issue if I go from Christian to Christian and you each have wildly different answers as to what is objectively immoral, as to what you may think the Bible, I'm assuming if you're a Christian, that's what you follow, what the Bible claims to be moral or immoral. It's the same subjectivity being used there to pick and choose what you're following and what you believe and what you don't.
Yeah, well, what do you mean by Christians have different, like, morality or whatever, like based on the Bible? What do you mean by that?
I mean that Christians have different moral standards and yet they still point to the Bible for standards that oppose each other. I know Christians that think certain things are sinful and Christians that think certain things are not. And both would say that God said that is so. So where is your objective standard? So what I'm asking for is where's your evidence that you're adhering to an objective standard for morality?
Well, this is kind of based on, I feel like this question is kind of based on the whole Christian subjectivity thing and how Christians have different moral standards. But could you give an example? Because I don't really think that Christians do. I mean, we have different denominational differences.
Some Christian, Caleb, you see where it says refused after your name because you decided to be smug and refused to just give the pronouns that you given before. So now we've put refused next to you. From now on, every time you call in, I'm just going to put refused next to your name because you're refusing to answer the question. Instead, you are lobbying to, I don't understand the question. Well, maybe you would if you were smarter. But the reason that the Promise is asked this question is because there are different views within people who identify as Christian on everything, on whether or not Jesus was fully human or fully God, everything with regard to theology and with regard to morality. There are Christians who do not think that homosexuality is sinful, and there are Christians who do think homosexuality is sinful. The point is, you're citing that you are a Christian and that you think you have an objective standard to point to. Not only do I not think your standard is objective, the foundation you're pointing to hasn't been demonstrated to be real. And Promise was pointing out that if we talk to 100 different Christians, we might get a number of different answers on all sorts of moral issues, all of which think they have an objective standard from their God. How do you resolve that problem?
Okay, well, I think that if some people who call themselves Christians believe in, if a very small amount of people label themselves as Christians, but yet believe something that most Christians don't believe in, I don't know if you could consider that a subjective thing, because if you're actually going to read what the text says, a Christian actually is, then, you understand what I'm saying?
No, Caleb, and neither do you. Because now you're no longer answering the question, you're making excuses. The point is, I need you to demonstrate that you have an objectively true foundation for morality. Otherwise, every one of your objections to subjective foundations becomes irrelevant because you have no solution for it. So demonstrate that you have a true objective foundation for morality. Go.
Okay, so the Bible teaches, you can't get a double meaning out of something. If the Bible teaches one set morality, which I think it does.
Caleb, stop. That's not only not true, but the Bible actually warns against this, warns against interpretation, and warns against differing interpretations. However, the Bible is still the product of subjective human minds, and it is a statement of opinion. You need to demonstrate that your moral foundation is objective and true. The Bible is neither demonstrably objective or true on moral issues.
Okay, well, you have, I don't know how far you're going to go with this opinion
You know what,
thing,
Caleb? I'm just going to mark you as refused.
You're not answering anything we're asking.
You have zero interest in ever answering any question. You called in to ask whether or not we view morality as objective. I answered the question. in detail. I acknowledged it. I pointed out hundreds of times over the last 20 years, that there is no objection against secular morality that is in any way solved by appealing to a God. Now you're claiming that you have a God and that it is an objective and true foundation of morality. Demonstrate why that is the case, or I will hang up on you for continually refusing to answer questions. Why? Demonstrate that there is a God that is an objective, true foundation for morality. Go.
Okay, well, you're talking about God now, but well, I mean, so God would create morality. God would create the objective standard for morality.
Caleb, we're done. I don't need you to tell me what you think God would do. I needed you to demonstrate that there is a God who is a true objective foundation for morality. It is clear you are incapable of having honest conversation on this and addressing the topic, so we're going to move on. Have a good Sunday. Go pray.
Oh, that was frustrating.
Here's what God would do. God would create a morality that would, yes, okay, you don't get to assume that if your model is true, your model is true. That's called circular reasoning. It's fallacious. You don't get to say that if my version of God is true, then God would create a morality based on an objectively true foundation. But that's not the case anyway. Because divine command theory, which is that God dictates morality, which is basically what Caleb was arguing for, not that God is morality, which is a separate Christian model, by the way, to dovetail into Promise's point of Christians disagreeing on things. There is a Christian model where God is morality, where morality is just that which is consistent with God's character. There's another morality where God dictates morality, God creates morality, and that's what Caleb did, or at least Caleb's sloppy language in trying to avoid answering a question for the 27th time suggested that God would create morality. That model is divine command theory. And guess what? It's subjective. It is subjective to the opinion of a God. So under that model, under Caleb's proposed model, we, the seculars here, agree that there's a subjective foundation of well-being, and we're going to run with that. And Caleb not only points to the subjective foundation of a God, but in fact points to his subjective opinion about that subjective opinion.
Right.
Because we don't have God to tell us anything.
Yep. Yeah, the opinion accusation was needed to be a finger back in that scenario. But this is where if people would just answer the question instead of try to keep their narrative going, then we could have a productive phone call. Just answer what we asked.
Hello, and that was, if I had to say, probably the worst clip I have ever seen on the line. Frankly, that was terrible because they say a lot of facts, but we have alternative facts on our side. Now, do remember that if you are seeing me next to some woman who, frankly, not impressed, but if she were to laugh, that would be an endorsement of me, Donald Trump. A laugh is an endorsement, so do not smile or your face will crack. Don't do it. You can't do it. Okay, I really thought she would break by now, so it's kind of ruining the bit I'm trying to do here. But you can like, you can subscribe. Oh, there it is. She endorsed me.